This is Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative. Today we're joined by the CEO of Daily Bread Food Bank, Neil Hetherington, to talk about the recently released annual food bank usage report, Who's Hungry? Thanks for joining me, Neil.
It's awesome to be here. Really looking forward to the conversation.
Excellent. So we're talking today because Daily Bread has released its annual Who's Hungry report, which maybe I'm a nerd, but it's something I read every year. And it's a really important touch point for how society is going, in my opinion. When I was in government, I worked on Ontario's food security strategy, so it's of personal interest to me. But I also think as things get tougher out there for people, it's provides really good insight into how things are going. So you're an organization that doesn't want record-breaking numbers, of course, but unfortunately, that's what's happened this year. So there's 4.1 million visits in 2025 to food banks in the area, which is a 340% increase since 2019. So since the pandemic, essentially. Have we gotten to a point where food security has shifted from a temporary emergency, or what's supposed to be a temporary emergency, to more of a long-term structural crisis at this point?
Well, first of all, you've got a lot of stuff in there. And to be clear, you're not a nerd for reading the report. It is a civic duty, and I think you're the coolest person going for having read the Who's Hungry report. And it sadly has been out for over 3 decades now. And things have not gotten better. That is clear from the numbers that are coming to food banks across the city of Toronto, to the Daily Bread Food Bank. So things are not getting better, and you're entirely right. It's chronic usage, where it's not just a stopgap measure. It's not just, I lost my job. It's this week or next week. I need support. And food banks have always been around. It's not just 40 years that food banks have been around. When you think about food charity, there's always been soup kitchens. There's always been food charity, but it was always temporary, and it was always short-lived. And now we are seeing individuals having to make use of Daily Bread and food banks across the country on a regular basis who ought not to have, to be very, very clear, right?
So something the report highlights is repeat visits, and also those who have had to skip meals to afford the essentials. And that's often what it is. It's not so much that people are just not buying food, is that they're having to make economic choices about what they're paying and when. What are some of the main pressure points that people are facing now? Like I've been looking, the other nerdy thing I do is I look at the job statistics every month across the country and how that's going. And what has really struck me about the unemployment crisis right now is that a huge number of the people, I think it was over a majority of the people who are unemployed, have been unemployed for over 6 months. So that goes back to the fact that this is more of a structural crisis. What are some of the other pressure points for people in this area?
Yeah, so again, a few things in there. So just in terms of the numbers, just so we're all grounded on the numbers across the country, about 10 million Canadians are food insecure. We have a population of 40 million, so 1 in 4 are food insecure. Never was like that before. And then there's different levels of food insecurity. And so in terms of the severely food insecure, 2.8 million, and there's about 2.8 million people who visit food banks. And the thing that I think is most alarming about the growth that we've seen in Toronto is that it's growth driven by individuals between 18 and 44, who 60% have a college or university education, and 50% of whom have a full-time employment. And so you say, listen, that social contract we once had of you go to school, you get a job, you work hard, you're going to be fine, that's gone. And so I'm deeply concerned about that, because that's also a demographic that I would say largely politicians ignore. They care about the seniors, they care about the children, and they've brought in things to assist both of those groups, whether it's the GIS, the Guaranteed Income Supplement for those who are 65 plus. You think about child tax benefits at the provincial and the federal level to support children. Recently, the Canada Disability Benefit to support those who can't derive their income from employment, who are experiencing a disability. So those are groups that people care about. But we don't care about those who are 18 to 44 and have a job and have a university education. Why would we care about them? And yet we need to, because the food bank's caring about them.
again, with causes of food insecurity, we know that obviously prices have been going up at grocery stores. Some of that is due to the pandemic and then other pressures across the economy. We have tariffs and things like that. So there's a lot of stuff going on out there economically, but also we seem to not be prioritizing making sure people are fed. And one of the biggest cost pressures, I think everybody knows, is housing at this point. So 88% of your respondents to your survey live in unaffordable housing, which I do think it's an interesting thing with surveys of like, I suspect most people will say they live in unaffordable housing at this point because it's true across the board, but an enormous chunk of people who go to the food bank, it's largely driven by housing costs. You previously worked in the housing sector, both on the for-profit and non-for-profit side. So I suspect you have a lot of insights into this pressure specifically. Do you think at this point we can even hope to address the food security crisis if we aren't addressing the housing crisis? Because, I worked at the Ministry of Housing 10 years ago. We saw this problem coming. We tried to institute some measures to address it, but, there's only so much you can do. At what point do you think we're just not going to get there on food if we can't get there on housing?
Before I jump into housing, let me talk a little bit about unemployment and frighten you a little bit. This is the very first time that there isn't a correlation between unemployment and food bank usage. When unemployment went up, food bank usage went up. When unemployment went down, food bank usage went down. This was the first time that we had skyrocketing food bank usage without skyrocketing unemployment. Now unemployment's catching up, and so that should start to cause a sense of panic among elected officials and the populace as a whole. So just one thing on unemployment to make you not sleep well. The other thing that's going to make you not sleep well is around housing. I was pleased to see the Canada Builds homes being funded at the level that it was funded. But at its peak, it's forecasted to produce just over 400,000 houses per year, which is about the exact same as the anticipated population growth of Canada. So we are going to run hard in order to tread water at best, and I can't think of a single government housing target that's been achieved at all levels of government, whether it's city. What was promised here in Toronto was not fulfilled. At the provincial level, there have never been, and you can go back decades, we have never fulfilled promises on that. And we haven't fulfilled the promise of the National Housing Strategy. And so I was in housing beginning in the 90s, and it was at that time that housing advocates were yelling pretty loudly, the federal government cannot get out of cooperative housing. It can't do it. And it did. And we had a nice, cozy, wonderful, balanced budget. And we could all be proud of that. But the deficit right now is in housing, and we're paying much, much more for it. And so both on the micro level and macro level. And so if you ask now Chrétien and Martin, the single greatest mistake they made domestically, they will say it was to pull out of cooperative housing. And we're going to be several generations before we catch up. And even with the current budget as it is right now, I'm a very optimistic guy, but I'm exceedingly cautious and a little bit pessimistic that we'll be able to catch up.
So part of the report is that you make recommendations as well. What are some of the recommendations Daily Bread is making around housing?
Well, there's quite a few. So with Canada Builds Canada Homes, you've got the bricks and mortar. That's great, but that's not going to see results for 5 to 7 years at least. There are opportunities to be able to speed up the construction cycle. When I was in the for-profit housing side of things, it would take about 2 years from parcel of land obtained to a building permit. Now the average across the country is 7 years. We as a nation used to build 600,000 houses per year just after World War II. We build 200,000 houses now per year. So there is something, given all of the technology, there is something fundamentally broken on that side of things. It takes funding. It takes unencumbered funding. And so let's not be, we've spent decades saying, how can we put together, partnerships and build coalitions of housing? And that really just skirts around the edges of the amount of housing that needs to be built. So there's that, but that's mid and long term. In the short term, it's renewal of housing supplements. We want to make sure that that people who have the opportunity to go into housing, they're just a bit short, have the opportunity to be able to get a housing supplement and get into that, and that can assist people who are experiencing homelessness right now. I was at Queen's Park this morning, and one of the things with that visit that we were talking about was the reality that if you're on disability in Ontario and you find yourself experiencing homelessness, the government says, hey, good news, you're not paying rent anymore. So we're going to take your $1,400 a month measly disability income, and we're going to cut it in half because you're not paying rent anymore. And then we wonder why the most vulnerable in our society can't somehow get first and last month's rent when they're only living on $700 a month in a tent. And so we need an injection of radical common sense, I believe.
So you touched on something that is something I rant about all the time, which is 90s austerity, 90s style austerity. And when I was at the Ministry of Housing, I thought about this all the time. Like, we saw the money being pulled out of social housing over that period of time. And even 10 years ago, we were feeling the reverberations of that. Like, there was a shortage there. There was, a lack of planning. There's something that you did say, which is something that strikes me all the time, is we talk about budget balance as if, like, if there's a fiscal balance, there isn't some penalty to be paid on the social infrastructure side of that. And we say, oh, it's balanced, but on the backs of who, right? At this point, when we do that kind of approach, and I think that's an approach that has been very popular in all, political stripes for the last 30, 40 years at this point, when we do that, we have these huge gaps that then take years to pay off. My dad likes to say, you can either pay me today or pay me tomorrow. And obviously the bill is always high tomorrow. So sometimes these investments, if you actually make them at the time, have huge payoff. The other thing that you talked about was how we're treading water. So the things we are doing now to play catch up are barely getting us by. And we're not going to get to the point where we're actually addressing a lot of these problems. I think about the wartime housing stuff because this is a Mackenzie King thing. I've got that campaign platform in a frame somewhere in my apartment. And it was a really, really big wartime effort to build housing. And I think at the time it was $400 billion of like 1940s money. So when we see the budgets that come out of the federal government, provincial governments, whatever it is, they just pale in comparison. Do you think that we can find the political will to catch up to that kind of vision? Or are we just sort of stuck in this, do as little as we can to get by?
Well, I certainly hope so. The poverty is incredibly expensive, and we rarely look at that cost. In Ontario in 2019, so it's out of date already. It was $30 billion just for the province of Ontario per year in terms of the cost of poverty. And that cost was costs with the healthcare system, with judicial system, lost opportunity costs, lost taxes. So it's incredibly expensive not to do something on with poverty. In terms of the deficit, I look at that and say, about 10% of our budget is interest payments. It would be good had we not amassed the debt that we have to be able to spend that some 90 or so billion dollars provincially and federally on debt repay, or not even repayment, debt interest charges, and have that go to things that will build a community where everybody can thrive. So we got a couple of hurdles here, right? We got to make sure that debt is repaid and we return to something where the interest is not taken away from social programs. But then it becomes, well, a question of priorities. Well, what are you going to sacrifice in the interim? And it seems to me that the most vulnerable have been sacrificed, and F-35s have been prioritized. And to me, that's exceedingly frustrating, because I believe that food security, I believe that the right to housing it should be a national security issue, much more so than the the doubling of defense spending that we've put. So there are ways to do it. And I am an individual who believes that you're better off when you can pay your bills, and as a government. But the bottom line is, ultimately, it's very expensive not to address housing, not to address poverty.
Something you touched on there, which I think is important, is if you don't take care of things domestically, you're not going to have to worry about things externally because the problems at home are actually going to become, insurmountable and actually become a political headache, which we've seen, throughout history. Something that you do draw out on the report is Canada's share of social housing as compared to other OECD countries. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because we seem to be laggards, and you've made some suggestions about where we should get to.
Yeah, we remember we Bowling for Columbine. Michael Moore used to do these documentaries. He'd come to Toronto, and he'd open up our doors because we didn't lock our doors. We lock them now. He'd go down to St. Lawrence, and he would say, "Look at all this gorgeous cooperative housing. Canada is is the paradise city." And we've walked away from that, and we've turned our back to individuals that we still call upon to do for a number of jobs in our society, and you can't afford to live and work in the same area. So I guess my hope is that we return back to being an international leader when it comes to the development of social housing, and that's my hope. But to get there will be monumental. That it will require significant courage, leadership, and fortitude from elected officials to say this is a national priority, not just in what is said, but in terms of how it is done.
One thing I do want to talk about is when we talk about housing, we're almost exclusively focused on home ownership. And we know there's a housing spectrum, there's a housing ladder that people move up or stay in certain positions on. But not everything is about home ownership. And we know other countries have had success by not only focusing on home ownership. In Europe, in plenty of places, you rent your entire life, and that's a perfectly reasonable economic solution for many, many families. We don't really think of that here, and we don't really focus on protections for renters or creating new rental opportunities. So my neighborhood that I'm in, we've got 9 towers going up. I'm pretty sure all of them are ownership based. There's nothing for renters. And I think if we're going to solve some of these problems, we need to create opportunities for people to rent, perhaps save some money because they're not renting at sky high prices,
Yep.
so that they can enter home ownership or just be able to afford to continue living and renting through their life. What are Daily Bread's suggestions for improving things for renters?
Oh, there's a lot on that. So, I mean, first of all, we don't build rental housing, and we haven't for decades. The math just doesn't math for developers to do it. It makes sense for them to build condominiums, or it used to, but we're seeing the cranes coming down on that front. The government has really. I remember after Kathleen Wynne was no longer the premier of the province, she and I had a meeting, and she said, "What could I have done differently when it comes to rental?" And when you think about it, it was such a humbling question to ask after service, and to be interested in it. And if you think about it, well, the government has removed property taxes. The government has removed HST from rental. The government has provided backing of mortgages for developers to be able to do it. And yet the math isn't there for them to do it. And so I'm not sure why we say it is only the private sector's job to build rental housing. If the math isn't there and we need it, then we need, as a collective, as a society, to say, it makes sense for us to be able to have rental housing where people want to live and to work, and therefore there is a communal effort on that front. And so getting government back into that. But the conditions really had been there for the market to build. But at its peak, we only built 14,000 houses, and that was last year. There were 14,000 rental units built in Ontario last year. And you think about our population, it's nothing. It's absolutely nothing,
Jeez.
despite being given everything that the development community said they needed in order to do it. So there are, Bill 60 has recently come out, and there's a lot of controversy over Bill 60 in terms of protection of tenant rights, providing clarity to landlords and tenants, and it's setting up. It's a challenging piece of legislation. I will, at face value, believe the government that their goal is to build rental housing through that, but then you also say to what end and at what cost. And so I think I hate to sound so glib, but the real answer to it is the government needs to get back into building rental housing, building and operating rental housing. Great cities do that around the world, and we cannot rely on the market to develop a product that is below market by its nature.
Yeah, I think what's missing from a lot of people in government is the understanding that some things are just important social goods and important social infrastructure that keeps the rest of society afloat and, helps create productivity and income for people because you've dealt with the actual baseline of things. And that seems to have just disappeared from government as a conception. Everything needs to, make some kind of return. We don't talk about social returns, but at the end of the day, I think you probably are right. Like, it is something that is needed. Therefore, if the private sector is not going to do it, then it is incumbent on government to step in. In addition to housing, there is the income side of things. So, the other way to address things is to just have people actually be able to afford things in the first place. Something that I've been looking at is the current Ford government's poverty reduction strategy. So this is something I worked on in government. So it's very close to my heart. And I know what previous poverty reduction strategies have looked like. This government has pivoted towards the idea that creating jobs decreases poverty, which is a nice sentiment, but doesn't always work out that way, especially at a time where, job creation has stalled, unemployment's climbing, work is growing more precarious, and traditional workplace benefits are just disappearing. So in that environment, this perhaps doesn't seem like the straightest way to solve poverty in this province. What does this tell us about the disconnect between employment and economic security that we're now seeing pretty much across the board in society, and how should we address that gap?
Well, I mean, to that first point or point earlier, fastest growing group of individuals, 18 to 44, who have jobs and an education. And so we know empirically that a job does not guarantee that you are going to get out of poverty. In fact, it's most of the food bank users who have employment. It's usually 2 or 3 jobs that have been cobbled together. And so, as you said, they don't have access to benefits, which can be, and so they're in that kind of awful scenario where they are too rich for any government support for prescription medications or other benefits, and they are too poor to be able to afford them, and so they're making those trade-offs. So I think that there needs to be an honest look on the income front when it comes to, first of all, fixed income, so support programs. So OW hasn't been changed since 2018. And I think we got to stop saying, listen, they're just watching the Flintstones. There are individuals who, for no fault of their own, are on OW, and there are individuals who want to get their way off of OW, and it's incredibly difficult to do. I think we have to ask the question, why do we believe, really right across the country, it's not just confined to Ontario, why do we believe that somebody with a disability income should be able to get by $1,000 below the poverty line? I mean, it's obscene. And so I would love for us to be able to say that if you find yourself on a disability plan, that at least the poverty line would be the minimum, and those who have disabilities actually do need actually much more income in order to get by. EI reform is certainly needed, and then I think looking at programs where somebody adjusting to the new economy, it's not going away anywhere. People are putting 2 or 3 jobs together. They're not getting benefits. You can't force employers to do that. So do you expand OHIP to be able to cover those types of things? That seems like it would be the most logical and most straightforward way to do it. Or do you present some sort of new package in EI that allows people to be able to afford supplemental benefits as self-employed individuals?
This is something that I've thought about a lot because, 10 years ago, even when we were working on that poverty reduction strategy, 70% of people who were low income were working poor. So there's always this sense, to your point, that people are just choosing not to work and hanging out with big screen TVs or whatever the narrative has always been. And that's simply not the case. Most people who are low income are actively working all the time. And there's just so many gaps. So when I think of the benefits piece, you have people who are either self-employed gig workers or working multiple different jobs, and they don't have benefits. And if you've ever been in that position and tried to figure out how to get benefits that are of some kind of reasonable level of usefulness for the price
Yep.
that they cost, it's very difficult. So, like, there are plans out there that, artists and creatives and individuals who are out there on their own can actually purchase into with other people in that similar kind of boat. And they've tried to create these apparatuses that, can cover a bunch of people off in those kind of circumstances, but they're still not the greatest plans. And then if you don't have that, well, you're kind of out of luck if anything happens,
Yep.
which, turns out with the health outcomes we have and rising disability from things like, COVID and other things, there's a lot of stuff out there that requires you to actually have these plans, and they just don't exist. And I think that the cost element of that too, like if you're paying out of pocket for prescriptions, which is something I do as a self-employed person, that can get expensive depending on what that prescription is. There's people love to talk about Ozempic as a weight loss thing, but it is functionally used for treating diabetes. And the cost of that, especially with, the weight loss craze around it, is astronomical. And if you
Yep.
don't have resources for that, now, never mind if you have children who have prescriptions, things like that, like that's what OHIP Plus was supposed to be about. So there's just so many different pieces to the workplace puzzle that no longer exist in the workplace, and people who don't have those kinds of traditional jobs just can't access anymore. I do think half of this battle is because of the fundamental changing nature of work and what the workplace offers to people at this point.
We clearly are articulating what the problem is. Individuals in the new economy don't have access to benefits that are affordable and useful. And so then you say, well, how do you pool together that risk? And it's great that artists come together and, do a shared pool, but that's a very small pool. And really why socialized medicine makes sense is because we're all in the pool together. Those who need the benefits and those who don't need the benefits, and that those who are sick and those who aren't sick. And that's why it works when you have the greatest number of payers in a pool. And so I think ultimately we have to, I guess we first have to, are we going to live with the consequences? Are we going to live with a society that is built on gig work and precarious employment? If we're competing internationally, we're probably going to be in that world. And so that's a reality. And so given that reality, how do we ensure that everybody can have the benefits that they should be entitled to?
So I want to talk a little bit about the client profile, and we're going to get into a couple of these different pockets. But overall, how has the profile of the typical food bank user changed in recent years?
Yeah, so there's certainly been the shift to individuals who are working, highly educated. That has been a growing number. Another segment of the population that's growing pretty significantly are individuals experiencing homelessness. It never used to be that the food bank was really assisting that group at a large scale, because they didn't have cooking facilities. But now we are seeing encampments, and we are seeing that they have access to be able to cook those meals, because that's where they're forced to live. And so that is a growing group of individuals. We did see changes, and we don't talk very much about it in the Who's Hungry report, but we did see changes when it came to changes that were made with international students. We don't talk about it because it generally goes down a very xenophobic road. And we as a nation need to, if we did not have immigration rates that we had, we would not have had GDP growth. We would have been in a structural long-term recession. And so we need to continue to embrace who we are as a nation that welcomes people. But we were lying to international students when we said to them, listen, you only need $10,000 a year to survive on. You can't really work, but $10,000 a year is all you'll need. You'll be fine. That was a lie. And so they were poor. They were hungry. They needed the food bank. And so we switched that to $22,000 per year. And as a result, there have been changes when it comes to the international student usage of food banks. So that's another group. And that's an area where my hope is that we have thoughtful conversation. Because I mentioned already that you can go down the xenophobic route right away, and conversely, you can say everything is good about the strategy we had, and I would love us to have a much more evidence-informed conversation about that is free of dogma, that allows people to say what is in the best interest of the person coming to the nation. How can we ensure that Canada welcomes those that need our nation and for health and safety, and how do we grow the economy at the same time so we can all thrive? And I just, camps get set up way too quickly on that one. So I've gone down a different route from what is the demographic, which was the question, but I think it's an important conversation to have an honest conversation about.
It seems to me that it's the shortcut that gets used to just explain away all of our problems as a country. And there are very deep-seated, long-held structural issues that have led to where we are now, regardless of whether, we have immigrants or not. One thing you did touch on earlier that I want to talk about, because it's something that really jumped out at me in the data that we never talk about, which is single people. So as you mentioned, there's no policy infrastructure for single people. It just doesn't happen. We talk about seniors, we talk about people with disabilities, rightly so. We talk about families with kids, and there are income streams for all these different groups. But we don't pay attention to single people as a part of the economy, as a part of our social infrastructure. We don't talk about them at all. And what really jumped out at me was the fact that 57% of food bank clients are single person households without children. And you talked about that earlier about people, most of them have university or college degrees, most of them are working, and yet they can't get by. It really reminded me of the 1980s, where you started to have dual income families because families could no longer get by on a single income. Are we at a point now in society where being single is the fast track to poverty?
Gosh, I think yes, and I think that there are other areas where you see that. Certainly in our demographic data, those visible minorities have a higher propensity for food bank usage, well beyond what the population is. So the Black community, 3.5 times the rate of population versus usage, and so there are other demographics that are of great concern. On the single and working, that's the part that is really hard, because when it goes back to the deserving and undeserving poor, I can get behind my tax dollars going to the disabled. I can get behind my tax dollars going to the elderly or children, but I can't really get behind somebody who is college educated and has a job and needs a food bank. Then you start going, what are they spending their money on? You start sounding like my dad. What are they spending their money on? They need to do X, Y. They need to do X and Y in order. It's just not the case. Nobody. I mean, rental expenses were never as high as a proportion, as what they are now of the average income. And so it's no fault of their own.
In terms of living costs, I think about this all the time as a single person. In terms of living costs, you are paying your rent entirely by yourself. There's no second person. And yes, a second person adds other costs in terms of foods and things like that. But even if you go buying groceries as a single person versus two people,
Yeah,
like the food goes further with two people
absolutely.
because
Absolutely.
there's less waste, there's less individual costs for things to get portions, all that kind of stuff. So there's that challenge. Then there's the fact that incomes just have stagnated completely. So
Yep.
if you're on that solo income, it's just not going to be doing anything, which obviously is a challenge for single parents as well, but they have other supports that they get from the government, which are just not available to single people. And I just think at this point, like it's just a really tough problem to solve and address that it's just not even on anybody's radar in government. Like you talk to anybody, like I'm sure at Queen's Park today when you went, like nobody was talking about this.
We were not talking about that. Think about somebody making $50,000 a year, a single person making 50. You go, okay, well, there's a decent income. That's $25 an hour. They're doing all right. So let's math that out. So you deduct about $15,000 for taxes. So you're around $35,000. Maybe you're paying about $2,000 in rent. You end up with roughly $500 a month to be able to pay for your clothing, your food, your transportation. So the average Canadian eats about $360 worth of food per year or per month. So now you're at $140 a month for your transportation. That gets you a Metro Pass. Now you haven't paid for. Now let's say you're self-employed with that $50,000. You don't have benefits. You can't afford a single drug. You in that budget, you have zero when it comes to any connectivity, zero when it comes to clothing, and so you can see very quickly how a $50,000 salary gets eaten up very, very quickly.
I think one of the biggest groups that we should talk about anytime we're talking about food insecurity and high costs is people with disabilities, of course. Now, an important thing to point out is that having disabilities doesn't mean you can't work. There are plenty of people with disabilities who work, and I think sometimes people forget that element of it. But having said that, there are other challenges and other costs associated with that. And this year's report shows that 31% of your clients have a disability. Now, the Canada Disability Benefit is something that is new and exists now, but it's a little low for what I think any disability advocate would have wanted to see. What are some of the improvements that Daily Bread is looking for in that benefit?
So I'll try not to rant, but I might sound a little ranty.
Go for it.
But you know what? Here, it can boil down into two pillars: access and adequacy. So it is hard to get. It made me so angry when the government put out its funding and said, here is $225 million set aside to reevaluate individuals who might be on provincial plans already, and we're going to just double check that doctor's work. So we partnered with the OMA, who was like, are you serious? This is 4.5, it takes about 3 hours of doctor time. So they were, the quick math of you're going to spend 4.5 million hours of doctor time when people can't get a family physician to redo work and spend $250 million to make that happen. So they made it incredibly difficult to access the benefit. Now, I do believe the government in their desire to change that, and I'll take them at face value that they will be changing things up on that front. And there was a bit of a nod to it in the budget. So the second pillar is around adequacy. I think what was so frustrating for the disability community was, and you'd have to ask them directly, but in my impression was that the expectations have been built so high that this would be, and it says it in the whereases clauses of the legislation, or I don't know, the preamble. It says, that it will move people out of poverty. By the government's own admission, only 25,000 people will be moved across that imaginary line, that poverty line, and so far lower than the expectations that have been built up. So we want to continue to give the opportunity for the government to change the adequacy side of things from $200 to what it should have been, which is about $1,000. And actually, I should correct that. It's not what it should have been. That would have got them to the poverty line. It needs to be the poverty line plus, because it is expensive to live with a disability, and it can be and it is gradual. It's a progressive benefit depending on income. And because you're quite right, there's some living with a disability that might have access to the tax credit or might have access to some income and don't need the full benefit. And so I like that type of progressive benefit.
We were just talking about, deserving groups, and this is always a challenge with anything related to needs, is that people have opinions about deserving. My classification is, are you a human being in Canada? Great. But one of the big groups that people think about when it comes to poverty is children, obviously. I think part of that is people not wanting they don't want kids to start off on the wrong foot. They want them to get every chance in life. And that starts with making sure kids are fed. So 1 in 4 food bank clients are children, and nearly 1 in 5 households have kids that go hungry every week, which is just something that should not happen in a country as rich as Canada. One of the recommendations of the report is to make the National Food Program permanent, and the 2025 federal budget committed to doing that.
Yep.
What kind of impact is that going to have on child hunger, and what else can we be doing?
Okay, so I'm going to back up. And 1 in 4 children go without food. Is a horrific stat of that. But here's the thing: I think we're underreporting that. So think about you being a parent, and you're now asked that question: does your child go hungry? And now, for pride reasons, you might say no, they never do. For fear of CAS, you might say no, they never do. And so, for those with the courage to be able to answer honestly, I applaud them, and I am concerned that number is underreported. So, it's a bad number to begin with. I actually think it's probably worse. I was glad that the federal budget listened to that recommendation and will legislate the permanency of the student nutrition program. In Ontario, we spend about, after the new items are put in the federal provincial deal, right now we'll be around 23 cents per child per meal. I don't know about you, but I can't feed myself for 23 cents. It is that basically is most of a granola bar midway through the morning. And so we're not alleviating that sense of hunger that child has. By comparison, Nova Scotia provides $3.20 for each meal. So I would like to make sure that both the federal and the provincial governments step up to that challenge. I think if we are going to do this national student nutrition program like every other one of the G7 or G20, that we need to do it right. Like, if you're going to do something, do it right. And we are the only ones who don't do it. And what I mean by doing it right, it means a cafeteria. It means a hot lunch. And I would love to see us get to that situation, so that that child can learn while they're at school. And then on the other side of things, when fully implemented, the average that would save the average family about $880 per year that they could put towards books and the other rent and the other expenses that they have.
So something else that the report brings up is the idea of a charitable fresh food tax credit, which I think is really interesting. Now, I have feelings about these things, because I think, obviously the grocery stores make a ton of profit and we should be doing more on that front. But given the reality we're in, direct cash payments or discounts that we can provide to people in terms of tax credits, whatever it is, those can be extremely, extremely helpful. And I think this also goes to address those people who are like, well, parents should be feeding their kids. Well, okay, here's an opportunity to help parents do that. How important is that proposal, and are there other proposals like that you're putting forward?
It's on its own, I would say. There's not a lot like that because really the advocacy positions that Daily Bread takes, by and large, it's not about increasing the amount of food through the charitable sector. We don't do that. We advocate for positions that will reduce the lineups outside of food banks, and so that's our primary focus. But this was one where, in the emergency that we're in, that could have benefit. Ontario brought in an Ontario tax credit, and it resulted in a lot of food not being plowed under, but being brought to food banks in a great way, direct from farm to food banks. And it made sense for the farmers, and it made sense for the food bank. And so, I applaud that, and I'd love to see it on a national level too. But the difficulty with it is you never want somebody to think that food is the answer, and it really boils down to what we've had substantive conversations about in terms of affordable housing, income support, precarious employment. Those are the tough things to deal with. We have more than enough food in the country. Canada, according to The Economist, is the world's greatest food waster globally. We do waste a lot of food, most of it at farms, and so let's not do that. It contributes to greenhouse gases. There's a whole host of reasons not to do that. But from an advocacy position, we put it out there because we think it will be helpful to farmers. We think it will be helpful to the environment. We think it will be helpful to food bank clients. And then we just do but guys, remember, this isn't the solution at the same time. And so we're walking a tightrope on that one.
I do want to talk about, where food banks get their resources, because it's not just food banks right now. We're seeing a decline in charitable giving across the board. We have been for over a decade at this point. And I think, though, that food banks get double dinged in that people who care about these kinds of issues are often some of the people who, during affordability crisis, during food security crisis, start to pull back themselves because they need to afford these things as well.
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit about the challenge that you're facing on that front? Because I suspect it's probably across the board in Canada with other charities such as yourselves.
It is. So Daily Bread, we had to increase so we don't take government funding, as I mentioned earlier. And so we had to go from raising about $8.5 million a year to $40 million per year. And all that does is maintain service levels. Our food budget, $1.5 million, now it's $22 million a year. Again, just to maintain service levels. So it's been really difficult. In the recent provincial hunger report, about 2/3 of food banks said they're real worried about whether or not they're going to be able to continue service, and many of whom have had to decrease the amount of food distributed. The Mississauga Food Bank had to lay off people. In Ottawa, they provided now about half the amount of food that they used to provide. So there have been hits that will directly impact the clients. So from a giving perspective, I have concerns that are some of the lower dollar donations, that they are struggling and having to make them lower than what they're able to do. And I have concern that some of the larger donations have gotten even larger. Now, I'm grateful, obviously, for those larger donations because we need them. But I really worry about us as a nation in terms of the divide between those who don't even think about providing us $1 million gift, because it's not going to really impact them at all. And those who are really struggling whether or not they can do $15 a month to the food bank. So the bottom line is on fundraising, it's difficult to do. Our food raising has been really challenging because as analytics and AI come into force, in significant ways, food wastage at stores is reducing because they're buying just the right amounts that you will purchase. And so we've had to go, we go direct to farms now to be able to pick up because industry is getting really good at being lean.
It impacts all charities, but specifically those dealing with food security. We've just had Giving Tuesday, which is a big deal in many charities. We're into the holiday season, which in a lot of the charities I've worked with, they make 50%, maybe even higher of their total haul for the year in this 4-week period. What kind of call to action do you have for donors in the rest of the year? Because I think we think of food banks at Thanksgiving and Christmas, but there's obviously need throughout the year. What is the call to action for donors the rest of the year?
Yeah, really, July and August are real challenging months for us because people are not thinking about donating food to the food bank, and kids might be home more and having to take time off of work. If you're an hourly employee, it's costly. So summer can be really difficult for folks. Um, you know, I'm not a great fundraiser, but I can articulate the stats of what is going on. And when people hear that, and when they see outside, their homes, their places of work, a lineup down the street that they never saw unless they were reading history books of the 1930s and soup kitchen lineups. We see that in real time now, and so they know that it's a real problem by the stats and the stories and the lineups, and then we give them the opportunity to help them divest of their wealth. And we make it sort of fairly straightforward for them to be able to do that. It's a compelling case, I would say. When you donate $1, we provide a meal. It's really straightforward. I was really proud to be among a team that received one of the top 5 impact charities across the country, and there's 83,000 charities, and it's because we keep things very, very simple. And we make that pitch for funding. We make a pitch for food, but we also say that it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter whether you're fancy pants or not. It doesn't matter if you've got a college education or not. Everybody can advocate for change. And so I really spend, I would say, more of my time talking about, please contact your elected official. Please say today's the day to build a better Canada.
I did want to talk about that as my last question, because something that is in the report's recommendations, which I really appreciated as somebody who's, been in activist politics and things like that, is that you make a call to action to the public to take action. And, for some people that might be making a donation, for some people that might be actually showing up and helping to sort food, whatever it is. But the point you just made too, one of the best things that you can do, one of the most impactful things you can do, is actually lobby your local MPP, your MP, your local councillor, whatever it is actually lobbying the people who make the decisions on these fronts. Just as we sort of close off here, what do you suggest the average Canadian do to try and help address this crisis?
It's just that. I mean, it's so incredibly easy. You can find the email address of your local, your provincial, and federal government, your representatives, very, very easily, and you just send them a note and say, "I listened to this podcast. Things aren't going the way that they ought to be going, and I'm not content with that." And I know neither are you. And I think you need to give the grace to each of the elected officials that they do want everybody to thrive in community. It doesn't matter which party. They all want a healthy Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And so help them walk back from the limb. Provide your solutions to it, and provide them the support that they'll need when they make very heavy, hard decisions, some of which might not be very popular, but are very needed.
Yeah, I think, that's ultimately, having been in politics, that is what tends to work, is just a large number of people actually showing that they care about an issue.
And you're right. We had 275,000 people write to Chrystia Freeland to say you need the Canada Disability Benefit. And what we were told time and time and time again is there's no money for it. But then there were 70,000 plus individuals who said, no, you need to change those priorities. And they did change.
There you go. So everyone get writing, get your emails going, and
Absolutely.
Convince people that they need to take action.
I am so grateful for the opportunity to have a deeper conversation. Sometimes when we talk about food banks, it's at a Christmas food sort, and there's politicians and there's people sorting food and that type of thing. But the real heart of the food bank is in the advocacy efforts to be able to one day put every food bank out of business.
You've been listening to Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative, a Canadian-owned company specializing in strategic communications, narrative development, and content creation. Our music today was composed by Elliot Middleton. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to access future episodes the moment they drop. Thanks for listening.